Winston Churchill was absolutely correct when he told the British Parliament in 1949 that the strangling of Bolshevism at its birth would have been an untold blessing to the human race. So why wasn't Bolshevism destroyed early, or at least contained to a large degree, with the help of the US and Britain? All the usual answers for the different target audiences disappoint. So the regular academics have simply repeated lame excuses. Of course, we're all smarter in hindsight, but that just doesn't really cut it. The leftists avoid this crucial question or answer that their messiah Lenin was just too clever and popular to be contained. The right wing gives us the usual speech about the lack of Christianity and traditional values back then. And the extreme right wing preaches the elders of Zion were behind it all and made Britain and the US support the communists, even though the elders of Zion were an invention by the Russian government, and then it was picked up by other governments. And this myth was further cultivated by other governments, especially Britain. So, a better answer is that Bolshevism and the Russian Civil War between the so-called whites and the reds were supposed to destroy the regular aristocracy in Russia once and for all before they became a massive threat. The so-called whites were pretty cold, cruel, ambitious, and weird. If they got rid of the Romanovs and forged new alliances with the French, some German and Baltic territories, China and Mongolia, or Japan in the future, the consequences would be potentially catastrophic for the British and the Americans. And who could tell how many average people would suffer as peasants under the Slavic or other Russian aristocrats and die as soldiers? So things weren't so simple back then. It wasn't like a very, very simple decision to make. Do we get involved as the Anglos? Do we not get involved? Do we support one side? Do we support the other side? Do we support both sides? And then pick who's going to be the winner. Very, very difficult. Now, ultimately, the psychopathic Vladimir Lenin became Russia's red dictator. However, if Bolshevism had been strangled at birth, it could have been the white Alexander Kolchak. Now, he was a bit of a fascist. He called himself the supreme ruler, and he was chiefly responsible for the so-called White Terror, alongside generals and warlords such as Grigory Semyonov and Roman von Ungern-Sternberg. Many of these characters were not even from traditional Rurikid Russian lineages. So you couldn't even say, okay, this person is really a Russian or not. It was all over the place. So Semyonov was a half Mongol and so much under influence from Japanese intelligence that the British eventually stopped paying and supporting him. Japan had 72,000 troops in Siberia and wanted to keep him around as some sort of a puppet. US Army intelligence estimated that he was responsible for executing 30,000 people in 1 year. So obviously that was a grave concern. The Japanese, they always wanted to take a big chunk of mainland and just expand their empire. And of course they were extremely fierce, especially if we remember the occupation of Korea for a while and what the Japanese tried to do during this occupation. This has completely changed these people there. And then we had Nikolai Robert Maximilian Freiherr von Ungern-Sternberg. He had a Baltic German background, so it's not really Russian in the more specific sense. He had a Baltic German background, and he claimed to be from the lineage of Genghis Khan and aimed to restore Imperial Russia as well as a Mongol empire. Wow. So Tsarist Russia was a backwards, failing empire which maintained medieval-style serfdom until 1861. While the Western powers had successfully experimented with a more or less controlled enlightenment so that more citizens could learn valuable skills in schools and work in the industrial sector, when the US started its colossal industrialization drive in the 1870s, and the British Empire was at the height of its power, Russia was a dumpster fire. It was clearly a dumpster fire. Now, power in Tsarist Russia, the power in Tsarist Russia had to be shared between the Romanovs and the regular aristocrats, who didn't want really to switch to a half monarchy like Britain or a full republic like the US, even though they could have played dominant roles in such a new system. They just didn't necessarily want it. The Romanovs were from the German houses of Hessen and Schleswig-Holstein, sub-lineages of the supercluster of Welfs, Wettins, and Reginars, same as the monarchies in Britain, Denmark, and other places. Now, this supercluster is extremely important. Historians know it exists. They just haven't really understood the meaning of it, the meaning of its size, its coherence, and its intelligence capabilities. So that was a very, very significant and very, very large group. So they had this advantage over other competing empires, such as the French. By having this super large group to draw personnel from and have a family-based intelligence service, because, intelligence services, they were a big thing in the past, even in the distant past, even in the ancient world, much bigger than we all previously assumed. So that's why, it was kind of a important thing that the Welfs, Wettins, and Reginars, got their people onto the throne in Russia, the so-called Romanov or Schleswig-Holstein Romanov-Gottorp family. That was a big deal, but that wasn't, mission accomplished yet. They didn't really fully control Russia. And on top of that, the supercluster wanted to be, not so in your face. So they tried to appear low-key in Britain. They wanted to make it seem like they were sharing a lot of power with the parliament and the population at large, making it look like capitalism, making it look like it wasn't as so much controlled. The merchant banks and the central bank and all of the British East India Company and all of that. So they were trying to be low key, and also the Brits, especially, and the relatives in Denmark, they didn't want to look as if they were super, super tight, with these Romanovs. They didn't want to create that impression because that would not have been strategic. So if there had been more established people in Russia, more powerful people in Russia, from that supercluster, they could have taken over Russia, and that would have been probably the end of the whole story, because who could then ever compete with the British Empire? Having not just the British islands, but also the colonies and other territories, and Denmark and Russian territories. So this would have been unstoppable, but they were not as successful at the time. So the Romanovs, they had to share power with these other aristocrats, and as I've just explained, these other aristocrats, they were quite weird, strange backgrounds, strange plans, wanted to make deals with the Japanese and all of it. So certainly the option was on the table for the supercluster to lend more than a hand to the Romanovs to smash the new leftist rebellions in Russia. But stabilizing the Tsar, stabilizing the Romanovs, would have also meant stabilizing the hated, these hated other aristocrats as well. And those were always seeking ways of ridding themselves of these Tsarist Germans who were not real Russians or Rurikids. If those Slavic aristocrats, if those other aristocrats, if these other aristocrats were secretly supporting communists and anarchists to a degree, intending to stir up chaos and then have a new aristocratic coup to restore order, the rule of the Romanovs would come to an end. Or these regular aristocrats, they could have just, these aristocrats could have broken up Russia in different parts. And so we have 5 Russias then, or a new Mongol empire, and some of these Russian states would have alliances with the Japanese. So complete nightmare, for the British Empire and the Americans. Very, very chaotic, very, very chaotic world that would have been. Very dangerous. So, the most logical option for the supercluster would have been to light Russia on fire, burn the place down, and start over. First, Russia needed to exhaust itself against Germany in World War I. The Russian regular aristocrats were compelled to spend their soldiers and resources, and then a massive civil war pitched so-called whites, members of the old system, against the Reds, the communists. So no other option than torching Russia must have been attractive to the houses of Hanover, Schleswig-Holstein, and Hessen. Russia could always be rebuilt later at a certain pace. There was no grand industry there anyway. The only damage would be in human lives, and at that stage in history, industry counted a lot more than the number of people. Britain certainly knew how to damage a foreign country. India was converted from a production powerhouse into a mess, a dysfunctional mess. China's old imperial dynasties had been pitched against each other. Why not do something similar in Russia? It's not too far-fetched, is it? But in this hypothetical scenario, the question remains if the Romanovs were in on the plan or not. It could have worked both ways. Britain had entered into an agreement with France and Russia against Germany before World War I. The Russians loaned all the money they could get from the West, built railways, artillery shells, and scaled the military up to 1.5 million men. The Germans knew they were in a weak alliance with Austria, and that was just how the game was played, how it had been played for a very, very long time in Europe. It's always the same. You try to position yourself inside of a bigger alliance so you can smash a weaker alliance, and these alliances were also constantly shifting. It was just the game. There was not a particularly bad group or a particularly good group. It was all very, very pragmatic, and we as the people nowadays looking at this, we also have to place ourselves into these positions back then mentally. We have to think about, what were the challenges of running an empire back then, because it's so easy nowadays to just whine and say these people were all bad, and then we draw conclusions from that now, and usually these conclusions are horrendously wrong. So we're dealing with empires. They did what they had to do. If they didn't do some really mean things and destructive things, they would have been taken over by other very, very mean empires. Okay? But there's still a lot we can learn from a critical view on history. So much we can learn, especially when we reconstruct the secrets that were decisive back then, because it still concerns, these secrets still concern us today. So, if there was indeed a plan by the houses, of Hanover, Schleswig-Holstein, and Hessen, the supercluster, Welfs, Reginars, and Wettins, to cause a civil war right after World War I in Russia, this plan would have been kept among a very small circle, and that may even have excluded the Romanovs. The danger would be catastrophic if a Romanov was caught and spilled the beans under interrogation. So in order to avoid that, you would keep this secret in a very, very, very tight circle. And of course, if you're a supercluster like that, that's older than 1,000 years, you know whom to trust. You know that you have people that you can absolutely trust because of multi-generational vetting. It was a very successful concept. So the Tsars had used their spy networks, including the Okhrana, to successfully infiltrate the socialist movements. The Okhrana may be the service we have files about, but it's unlikely to be the only service that existed and mattered. We must consider the possibility that the Tsars could have envisioned, among other options, to have a transformation in Russia which would wipe out the other aristocracy, the regular aristocracy, just get rid of them, and have a continuation of Tsarist rule with with a controlled socialist dictatorship underneath. That was one option to pick from, right? So you can just try a Roman-style dictatorship, like in medieval times or the ancient times. You can do a staged sort of republic. You can do like a half monarchy, half republic mix, which is also very controlled by secret means. There's only so many options you had at the time. So many systems you could copy from other nations. So you need to understand this. The British nobility developed their own brand of socialism through the Fabian Society and the London School of Economics. So the era of classic colonial rule was coming to an end, and we can gather from the imperialist authors of the initial Fabians that imperialism and serfdom were supposed to get a new left-wing image, or just a different sounding name, right? So socialism was not really meant as something new. This was not some weird idea that came from weird people here and there. Certainly not not from the elders of Zion, which don't exist. But this was just these ideas going around in very, very powerful elitist circles. They were using capitalism, or mostly controlled capitalism, using it to the to the maximum level that they could use it, but they were pretty sure that this system was going to have a lot of losers. There's always going to be a lot of people that don't really make it, and they will never have significant assets, and they will be angry about it, and so there was this idea in powerful circles a long time ago. This idea: can we have a bureaucratic system, a planned economy where we can designate roles to these citizens, and then they would have to fulfill these roles, and it would be a safer place in many ways for the people, but they could never break out of it, and they would be at the total mercy of the ruling class. It's basically a new type of serfdom. It's a continuation of the old serfdom, just with a different name and some different coat of paint. So it is possible that the nobility miscalculated, got spied on by the new communists, and ended up in a situation where they felt they needed to have a working relationship with the communists in order to stay relevant and avoid total decline. It is also conceivable that the czars and the British throne had full control over the communist movements in Russia the whole time. Controlling the Bolsheviks was neither complicated nor expensive. Now, of course, you understand that this would have the gravest consequences. If there was this control, secretive, intelligence, secretive control over the Bolsheviks the whole time, and there is some significant data on that, and also we can deduct things. We can, take things that we know, and then we can logically get to things that we don't already know. So if that was the case, if the Bolshevik movement was indeed under control by super aristocratic intelligence, especially that very old supercluster, then we would be dealing with you could call it a secret mega power. It wouldn't even be a superpower. It wouldn't be an Eastern superpower and a Western superpower. It would be one thing, and nobody's supposed to know about it. Would be like a mega power, and this whole structure can only exist as long as nobody really understands it that exists. It would fall apart the moment people realize what it was. And so in this hypothetical scenario, and I've run these calculations, I've done all that. It does make a lot of sense. It would explain a lot of things, why the tremendous help for the communists, for the Soviet Union, all the trade and all the appeasement for so long, why Western intelligence failed so much at stopping communist intelligence. It would make sense from a different angle, because you would have the secret structure and you could just basically keep any other country out of your way. No other country, no regular country could ever compete with the superstructure. And you could stage these tensions. You could always stage this thing, threaten a nuclear war to scare everybody, and so this secretive super or mega structure, they would keep all the competition weak. So that's kind of one of the gravest scenarios. Of course, if that's the case, then we have a whole different problem on our hands now, but also different opportunities. And another big scenario is that the original plan just went off the rails. The aristocracy, or the super aristocracy, they try to make this change happen in Russia, get rid of the old aristocrats, these regular aristocrats, have a new system, and then try to control this new system, but it went off the rails. And that's when you make secret deals with the communists, and this is something we have a lot of evidence for, especially when it comes to Britain. Britain sort of shielding the atomic spies and just sabotaging a lot of things. Lord Louis Mountbatten, there's a video on this channel on Lord Louis Mountbatten and all the stuff that basically he did for the Soviet Union. Lord Louis Mountbatten had access to virtually all state secrets in Britain, and he was highly compromised, very compromised figure, and he had a communist wife, and he had best contacts to the Soviet Union. And he was compromised 10 times over. His private life, which was very, very extreme, and also, when he was supposed to collect very, very sensitive documentations from his relatives on the European mainland after World War II, containing information on highly secretive missions against the Nazis, spying on the Nazis, managing a lot of things is very, very crazy and very, very harsh, very dangerous. And so Lord Louis Mountbatten was supposed to gather these documents and bring them home for further study, but he sent the wrong person to get the documents, a person who was a Soviet spy. And so what do you do if you're compromised like that as a whole big as aristocratic supercluster? Well, you make deals with the communists, and that means you help them quite a bit. You also give Soviet Russia access to some of these old British networks in America. Groups like Skull and Bones, this, that, and the other. And of course, Skull and Bones was very instrumental in helping the Soviet Union. So it's more than just, we just hoped it would work out, with the Soviet Union. We hoped we could deal with them. Or we just didn't know how dangerous it was, or blah, blah, blah. We just wanted to sell things and make profits. This was a social experiment to us over there. We wanted to see how it goes, blah, blah, blah. No, it would be a very serious... there were probably very serious reasons for what happened. So, the U.S. State Department began to finance anti-Bolshevik or anti-communist forces in November 1917 at the latest. The Americans laundered money through the British and French to send the American Expeditionary Force to Russia in Operation Archangel. The stated goal was to protect military stockpiles in Arkhangelsk in the north of Russia, fight the Bolshevik army, and reignite the Eastern Front against Germany. For this, the United States sent a measly 5,000 soldiers to one area and several thousands more to Vladivostok. Not a whole lot. A total of 170 British troops arrived on March 4th, 1918, the day of the signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk between Germany and the Bolshevik government. 170 British troops. By early fall, British forces in the Murmansk region were about 6,000 strong. The Americans had arrived as well by then. The Allied troops were mainly inactive in the winter of 1918, building blockhouses. And then you saw a few battles and skirmishes. In the Battle of Tolgas, 1,000 communist troops attacked the Allied defense line and were repelled. Some of the British leadership thought that the only way to achieve success in ejecting the Bolsheviks from power was by raising, training, and equipping a large white Russian army. But as I explained, that wasn't really a popular option because these whites were crazy, half Mongols, and just wanted to make deals with the Japanese. So public recruiting began at home in Britain for the newly created North Russian Relief Force, a voluntary force which had the claimed sole purpose of defending the existing British positions in Russia. By the end of April, 3,500 men had enlisted, and they were then sent to North Russia. Over the course of 1919, most of the Allied troops were sent home. Some of the white Russian forces switched sides to the communists. It seems the Americans and the British forgot to bring some money to buy the whites' loyalty. So nobody was really making a big effort over there. I mean, nobody from the outside really was making a huge effort over there. The Allies just went home and watched the Russian Civil War unfold, which claimed the lives of roughly 8 million people and cemented the rule of the Bolsheviks. The White Russian Northern Army was left to face the Red Army alone. Poorly disciplined, they were no match for the Red Army and quickly collapsed when the Bolsheviks launched a counteroffensive in December of 1919. So just for, the comparison's sakes, by the end of World War I, 4 million men had served in the United States Army. 4 million men, with an additional 800,000 in other military service branches. By the end of 1918, the British Army had reached its maximum strength of almost 4 million men and could field over 70 divisions. All of this to squash Germany, but to save Russia from Soviet communism, both the US and Britain were willing to deploy only a few soldiers each. A lot of money was spent in the war against Germany, but for some strange reason, there was a failure to pay the White Russians adequately against the Reds. Ultimately, about 83% of all Red Army divisional and corps commanders were ex-Tsarist soldiers. So they all switched sides, and they were, regretting that later. So, then there's the question of the Western supplies sent to the Whites. It was never enough, and it often ended up in the hands of the Reds, which is not surprising given the massive intelligence failures and the famous Operation Trust. So, there was an argument of pragmatism. The British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, became unwilling to fund the Whites. He declared Udenage to be a notorious reactionary. For example, the British Foreign Secretary Lord Curzon later advised the Finns not to support Udenage. The President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, was also suspicious of Russian reactionaries such as Admiral Kolchak. Both Lloyd George and Curzon were fearful of creating a strong Russia, which could threaten British imperial possessions in Asia. So, in November 1919, Lloyd George declared in a speech to Parliament that a white victory would not be in the British interest. A white victory would not be in the British interest, and from this point on, the British stopped supplying arms and began negotiations with the Bolsheviks. After Lloyd George's speech to the House of Commons, British observers with Denikin's forces reported that morale collapsed. The Whites had failed to convince the Allies to supply them with the necessary numbers of troops or weapons. Moreover, they proved incapable of making effective use of the 850,000 rifles supplied by the Allies. Kolchak's army had a supply line of 4,000 miles, way too long, with a single-track railway that suffered badly from lack of control. Left-wing rail workers diverted whole train loads to the Reds. 4 out of 5 of the peasants conscripted into Kolchak's White Army deserted. Many simply transferred to the Reds. The situation became so asymmetrical that the Red Army ballooned to several million fighters, while the Whites never came close to 1 million. We can tell from the limited campaign what had been possible. What was possible with a real effort, but that would have meant empowering the Whites, who were not from the houses of Hessen and Schleswig-Holstein. Some very powerful circles must have made the very specific decision to let Russia burn to the ground, Watch the Civil War unfold and watch the whites die or flee. Even during the 1920s and 1930s, when it was totally clear to everyone the Soviets were psychopaths hell-bent on creating a monster army, Britain and the US did not seek to intervene but instead kept selling whole factories to the USSR. In 1949, Churchill stated to the British Parliament, "I think the day will come when it will be recognized without doubt not only on one side of the house, but throughout the civilized world that the strangling of Bolshevism at its birth would have been an untold blessing to the human race." Well spoken. In a further speech at the National Press Club, Washington, D.C. in June 1954, Churchill lamented, "If I had been properly supported in 1919, I think we might have strangled Bolshevism in its cradle, but everybody turned up their hands and said, 'How shocking.'" So what are the excuses? We've talked about pragmatism, and certainly Churchill was a very, very privileged man. I mean, even more privileged than other prime ministers in Britain. So we know by now that he had access to more secrets than others, and he was made a dictator for a while by the king, by the supercluster, the aristocratic supercluster, and we know that Churchill himself was from an aristocratic, very old family, the Marlborough clan. And if you trace back the Marlboroughs, they actually worked for the supercluster, and they did so for a few hundred years. Now, the supercluster, Welfs, Vettans, and Reginards, they're quite a bit older. They're more like 1,000 years or at least 1,200 years old. Imagine that, 1,200 years. But the Marlborough family, they came later, and they attached themselves to the cluster, and they served the supercluster generation after generation, and this is how it was done, multi-generational vetting. But even so, Churchill apparently, in my professional opinion, Churchill was never fully in on it. He was never, privy to all the secrets. So, he was probably given a bunch of excuses back then. Other high-ranking people, military officers, intelligence officers back then, with the British, the Americans, they were all told some variation or another of this pragmatism. Well, we can't support these whites. We can support these whites. We can give these crazies all these weapons and a new dictatorship, and then they work with the Japanese and they create a new Mongol empire. They're gonna become a massive headache. And so we can tell they would kill a bunch of people. We would tell they would start all kinds of wars, and it would cause millions, if not tens of millions of deaths. And by that time, chemical weapons were a thing, and biological weapons were a thing. So who knows how many people these whites were going to kill. So with that pragmatism in the back of your head, these people probably, were accepting this pragmatism back then and said, okay, if this is the way to go, this is the way to go. These Russians are responsible for their own fate for the time being. I mean, we're going to get involved, but some way or another, working with whoever wins or we want to win. But for the time being, let's just watch them burn Russia to the ground. These people over there, they will attack each other, and then we'll see what comes afterwards. So it's not like every one of those Anglos or high-powered Anglos was a psychopath. It's not that simple. But you have to watch that hidden hand of that supercluster. So mainline historians will hide behind pragmatist thinking. World War I was finally over. Nobody was thrilled to continue the fighting somewhere else. Influential people sometimes hoped that socialism would be nice and work out. There were communist spies in the West influencing people's opinions. The politicians worried about the next elections. The politicians were stupid. But none of these excuses really explain all that, because it was just too big. The help for the Soviet Union that came afterwards was just too big. And, we do have to reconstruct the secrets. We do have to reconstruct, the big secret operations, and none of these excuses actually attempt to uncover these secrets. So anti-communist intelligence historians will just say that communist intelligence was capable of miracles, running in God mode persistently, while the US and Britain were mediocre in this regard. The Soviets came up with the idea of infiltrating the whites and create the Trust, a fake anti-communist organization. But this doesn't explain everything either. The Western intelligence effort to help the whites was just as designed to fail as the military campaign in northern Russia. The conspiracy authors will of course say that Britain and the United States were under control of the Jewish world conspiracy and therefore paved the way for the USSR. Russia owed Britain a staggering £600 million, but the communists simply stated the debt has been paid in blood and the war only happened because of international capitalism anyway. Now, the conservatives in Britain rightfully argued that Bolshevism was dangerous and could ultimately spread to British soil. The Russian revolutionaries stood in opposition to all that the conservatives held sacred: property, religion, tradition, class. Churchill called the Bolsheviks ferocious baboons. They were leading, quote, a war against civilized society which can never end. They seek as the first condition of their being the overthrow and destruction of all existing institutions and of every state and government now standing in the world. The United States was happily selling more and more technology to the USSR. If normal people questioned this, the answer was, well, maybe the USSR will work out and we can make profits. If a right-winger questioned this, the answer was, though the Jewish Rothschild conspiracy is very powerful in the US and behind these sales, and left-wingers obviously didn't question these sales at all. Strong argument was cost. World War I had cost £9 billion, and despite the dramatic rise in the tax rate, only 28% of the cost had been paid through taxation. The remaining £7.2 billion deficit had been covered by heavy borrowing from London banks and the issuance of war bonds. Now, of course, in the whole British banking system was an aristocratic affair. They created a central bank, the bond market, and they had these phony private merchant banks, and it was all very much under control. But it wasn't supposed to look like that. You know, everybody else doubted it. Everybody else didn't see how fully centralized it was, and nobody really wanted to copy it at first. Everybody thought this was never going to work. But the British system did work, and that's when other countries started to copy it. So back then people looked at the numbers and said it was cheaper, much cheaper, to watch Russia burn to the ground. Lord Milner, however, claimed in his letter to the Times that a sudden withdrawal from Russia would result in the unimpeded spread of Bolshevism. Fair point. If this occurred, the consequences, quote, would assuredly involve a far greater strain on the resources of the British Empire than our present commitments. Britain had also acquired extensive mandated areas in the Middle East, which proved to be expensive dependence. The other members of the empire, the Dominions, had grown more independent during the war. So who wanted new troubles? Who wanted more space to, manage and pay for? So the British citizens were concerned with reconstruction, jobs, taxes, and the building of new houses. Straining the budgets even further would alienate the people and drive them towards Bolshevism, a report declared. Almost every family had lost someone in the war. Others were traumatized upon their return or disabled. The slogan became Russian self-determination. Let them decide their own fate, which meant let Russia burn to the ground. The Americans didn't have the same financial problems as the British, though. They surely could have decided to intervene in Russia, at least to create a situation where Russia breaks apart into several pieces that do not like each other. It wasn't a question of going all in or nothing. Not only did the Americans fail to play it safe, but they sold the most technology to the USSR by far. The common explanation of American capitalist greed, lack of foreign intelligence experience, stupidity, politics, and Soviet espionage influence are not good enough, at least not for me. In 1919, Churchill heard a report from the French General and Army Chief of Staff, Henri Albi, that the Red Army could be easily defeated by inferior numbers of Allied troops. Balfour was having none of it. He set the tone for the discussion by stating, all would agree that for military and political reasons it was impossible to contemplate any great military operation in Russia with a conscript army. Contradictory to Henri Albi's estimates, Churchill was supplied with numbers concerning the costs of intervention. The figures were frightening. It would cost £73 million to conduct very insignificant operations for the next 6 months in the Archangel-Murmansk theater alone. The French premier was staggered by the figures and believed they were accurate. So it's, you could actually spend the time and the work and figure out some more accurate numbers. Would it have been cheaper than they said, or would have been possible just supply stuff and make that happen? I mean, later, the Allies or the Anglos, they did supply a lot of material to the Soviet Union in the fight against the Nazis, and that made all the difference. So somebody was not honest back then. Somebody played some other game. So it speaks volumes already how Britain and the US abandoned the White Russians militarily. Did they also betray the Whites on the intelligence front? While we have much literature on intelligence failures, there is virtually no analysis whether the Brits and Americans deliberately sabotaged the Whites by handing intelligence to the Reds or not sharing crucial intelligence with the Whites. Experts in Soviet intelligence usually just point at the sophisticated trust operation, which posed as white but was really red. The communists somehow had acquired a very high degree of spycraft, whereas the Anglos were no match, we are told. In reality, Anglo espionage is very, very old. It's over 1,000 years old. Especially this aristocratic supercluster was the best at it. It was the largest group, most professional group, and they've had spy capabilities for roughly 1,200 years. They were actually very, very good, but nobody's supposed to know that. And also, you have to imagine, you run a British Empire, at least the part that you can see, with the colonies and whatnot, and allied countries such as Denmark with the same families running it. You see it, you look at this empire, and you have to realize that every empire runs on information. Where to spend money, where you have money, how much you have of this, how much you have of that, where to put your troops. It runs on information. You have to know if there's a rebellion brewing somewhere, or if the enemy wants to attack you, or where the enemy is weak. It runs on information. It needs a massive empire needs massive spycraft, and so but historians, they never really wanted to get into that. They claim that spying really started in the 20th century. That's what they told us, but that's pretty much a silly idea. So yeah, conventional historians idiotically insist Britain had been running its massive global empire without a real proper foreign intelligence service and only improvised overnight in the early 20th century. Likewise, the United States supposedly never bothered to create a real foreign intelligence service before the OSS. In reality, intelligence before the 20th century was off the books, handled by elite families, mostly aristocrats, not subject to parliamentary scrutiny, no official headquarters, no official budget, no official name, no files accessible to the public. That's it. So after the revolution and the civil war, in Russia, the British aristocracy played dumb. The Tsar and his immediate family had vanished instead of having him exfiltrated to save British or Scottish or Danish territory. Sure, the British population was happy that it didn't have to partake in another major war right after World War I, but the entire country of Russia falling under communism, this just didn't sound right at all. So a hefty bit of political marketing was necessary. The people were told the government, or Her Majesty's government, had attempted heroic, dashing efforts to assassinate Lenin and Trotsky and smash the Bolsheviks in a coup. The suave secret agent chosen for the mission was Sidney Riley, a spy for the ages. The problem was Riley was the fictitious name given to a dangerous criminal who played all sides to enrich himself. First, the Russian-born Riley was employed by Scotland Yard's Special Branch and later by the Foreign Section of the British Secret Service Bureau, the precursor to the modern British Secret Intelligence Service, MI6 or SIS. He ultimately disappeared in the chaos in Russia in the mid-1920s, and we are supposed to believe he fell for the Soviet deception operation called Trust. A fake anti-communist organization was arrested and killed. Almost, the story goes, did he pull off an assassination of Lenin in a coup against the Bolsheviks. In 1932, the journalist Sir Robert Hamilton Bruce Lockhart, who had also served as a secret agent and as British consul general in Russia, was allowed to publish the book Memoirs of a British Agent, which turned into a bestseller. Well, if they want something to be a bestseller, they make it a bestseller. And normally it wasn't, the government didn't like to see anybody just, publishing novels or nonfiction books about espionage, because you wanted to protect not just information, but also methods. It was illegal to give away a lot of methods used by the intelligence community. But if they wanted a bestseller, they got a bestseller. Newspapers dubbed Riley the greatest spy in history, and his legend became that of the dominating figure in the mythology of modern British espionage. What a hero! This fiction is what the audiences were meant to believe. DeWitt Clinton Poole, an American consular and intelligence official in Russia, in contact with the anti-Bolsheviks, was convinced that Riley was a traitor. U.S. Secretary of State Robert Lansing allegedly initiated the plot involving Riley, the assassination plan against Lenin, and the attempted coup. So who was Riley, the man entrusted with strangling Bolshevism in its infant state? Nobody could even really figure out who Riley really was, where he was born, and who his parents were. According to reports of the Tsarist intelligence service Okhrana, Riley was arrested in 1892 for political activities and for being the courier for a revolutionary group known as the Friends of Enlightenment. He escaped judicial punishment, and he later was friends with Okhrana agents such as Alexander Gramatikov, and these details indicate that he was a police informant even at this young age. That would mean he betrayed other people for money. He then traveled abroad and may have robbed and murdered a duo of anarchists near Paris who were carrying substantial funds. Under the fake name Rosenblum, he became a paid informant in London for the émigré intelligence network of William Melville, Superintendent of Scotland Yard's Special Branch. It seems as if he poisoned the husband of his lover, Margaret Thomas, so he could inherit £800,000. According to a description, it is likely he temporarily assumed the identity of a doctor and filled out a death certificate for natural causes. With the help of Melville, he received the new identity of Sidney George Riley. We cannot rule out that Scotland Yard knew about the murder and used this to control Riley, who was expected to embark on a dangerous spy mission to Russia. After all, he was now a rich man. Why else would he risk his own life? It seems as if he used the first opportunity in Russia to sell secrets to the Japanese to enrich himself. Historians disagree about virtually everything that concerned Riley's further spy career. Probably Riley failed at most assignments and simply invented heroic tales, which is very common in the intelligence business. You just make up stories and sell that for a lot of money. And he was ultimately sworn in by Mansfield Cumming at the British Secret Intelligence Service and returned to Russia, where he met his old companion of the Okhrana, Alexander Gramatikov, and was able to obtain travel permits as a Soviet Cheka agent and hand over SIS money to anti-communist groups. The anti-communist circles were already infiltrated by the Cheka, and the service had furthermore gained access to the British diplomatic codes. Eventually, it was not Riley and his allies who took the chance to take out Lenin, but Fanya Kaplan, a member of the Socialist Revolutionary Party. She fired 3 shots with a Browning pistol. One bullet narrowly missed Lenin's heart and penetrated his lung, while the other bullet lodged in his neck near the jugular vein. The Red Terror campaign followed, including a raid of the British consulate in Petrograd. Lockhart got off easy, unlike many others, while Riley escaped. The SIS sent Riley back to the south of Russia soon after, under a new false identity, and he reported that the whites even lacked the necessary money for printing propaganda and other purposes. In September 1925, in Paris, Riley met Alexander Gramatikov again, White Russian General Alexander Kutepov, counter-espionage expert Vladimir Burtsev, and Commander Ernest Boyce from British intelligence. This assembly discussed how they could make contact with a supposedly pro-monarchist anti-Bolshevik organization known as the Trust in Moscow, which was fake. It is claimed that after Riley crossed the Finnish border, the Soviets captured and interrogated him at Lubyanka prison. The Soviets publicly said they executed him. Some officials in Whitehall and the Secret Service trusted neither Riley nor the Russian Trust. organization. In the year after Riley's disappearance, the trust was publicly exposed. The Soviet dossier on his interrogation mentions that he had used the cover name Sidney Burns in the United States. When the Soviet military intelligence officer Walter Krivitsky defected to the West, he told the Americans they had been penetrated through a man named Sidney Burns. Even Sir Robert Hamilton Bruce Lockhart started to turn against Riley in public. So authors see in Riley what they want to see: a brave spy who got fooled by smarter Soviet spies, the man who almost destroyed the Bolsheviks on behalf of the British Empire and the United States, or a traitor who sabotaged the whites and was greeted laughingly by his comrades afterwards. Yet the British leadership ultimately had the power to decide the fate of the whites. It would have been easy to sabotage these operations and create excuses to provide plausible deniability. Inquiring people are supposed to lose themselves in the maze of spies, double agents, and moles. So, we can pretty much tell the decision was made. We're going to let the Reds win. We're going to make or help the Reds win, and we're going to watch these whites fail. And this decision means we have to hold back on our military actions, and we also need to hold back on our intelligence missions, and then we just watch Russia burn to the ground. So, the next thing I wanted to mention is the missing Romanovs. Okay, so no mythology, no legends and fairy tales, just the facts. Just what we can tell about the missing Romanovs. According to the usual history, the members of the Tsar's family were murdered on the night of July 16th to 17th, 1918, by a commando from the Soviet State Security Service Cheka in the basement of the Ipatiev house near Yekaterinburg. The bodies were partially destroyed and buried. Lenin is said to have decided on the death of the Tsar's family, which makes no sense at all. It would have been cheap and effective to kidnap them, interrogate the Tsar for incriminating information about the whole House of Hessen, make him write a series of confessions of seeing the errors of the old system, embracing socialism, and make photographs and film recordings for potential future use. They could always decide at a later point to keep all that material hidden. Another option was to publicly use him as a kind of advisor and blesser of the socialist system. We know that the exiled Romanovs were toying with a similar idea, and in today's Russia, in today's Russia, national Bolshevism is all the rage, combination of left and right ideologies to create sympathies internationally. Another strong possibility is that the Tsar and his family members were sold for ransom money and new trade contracts to Britain, Scotland, or Denmark. New trade contracts to Britain, Scotland, or Denmark with new identities. If the news had become public that the Tsar was alive and well in exile, this would have complicated everything. The Tsar would have been a valuable bargaining chip, just like captured spies are regularly traded for other captured spies between countries hostile to each other. So, best option for the communists was to just, sell the Tsar and his close family back to his relatives in Britain, Scotland, Denmark, whatever. Just sell them back and have a contract and basically put down in the contract that for all intents and purposes the public is supposed to think that the Tsar has disappeared. Not even make a statement really, or not even be too specific about it, but just make everybody think he's dead. And dead and gone, right? That would have been the best choice. An announcement in the local newspaper by Bolshevik War Commissar Philip Goloshyokhin, in overall charge of the family's incarceration in Yekaterinburg, said, "All those under arrest will be held as hostages, and the slightest attempt at counter-revolutionary action in the town will result in the summary execution of the hostages." Valuable hostages. Goloshyokhin later played a deadly role in the Sovietization of Kazakhstan, leading to the Kazakh famine of 1932 and 33, in which 1.5 million people died. He was ultimately killed himself during a purge. Lenin was said to have planned to put the former emperor on trial in a grand public spectacle, with Leon Trotsky acting as chief prosecutor. Somehow he and his colleagues decided against it, we're told. The Cheka agent Yakov Yurovsky, directly responsible for the captured Tsar, insists he had gotten the order for execution, but there is no way to verify this. The story goes that the engine of a truck in the courtyard of the Ipatiev house was revved up to drown out the noises of the murders. The Tsar's family was lured into the cellar, the death sentence was briefly read out, and the men opened fire, requiring several volleys. One of the guards, Alexei Kabanov, told the killers to cease fire and to use their bayonets and gun butts to minimize the noise. None of this makes any sense. Why hadn't the Cheka simply used poison? Used poison and blown up the bodies with dynamite, nearby in a forest. No shooting would have been involved and the bodies would have turned to tiny droplets. Why weren't the Romanovs transported to safer territory or driven to the gigantic woods nearby, shot and buried, never to be found again? At a telegraph office in Ekaterinburg on the 18th of July, Thomas Preston, a diplomat at the British consulate, attempted to cable to Sir Arthur Balfour in London, "The Tsar Nicholas II was shot last night." On the 19th of July, Golosh Yochin announced at the Opera House on Glavny Prospect that Nicholas the Bloody had been shot and his family taken to a secure location. So which is it? So Nicholas shot and his family taken to a secure location. The alleged murderers took no photos, made no film recordings, there was no confession that the Tsar had to write, no show trial, nothing. We are supposed to believe it was only many decades later, after the end of the Soviet Union, that Russian, British, and American scientists presented DNA evidence based on bone remains from a forest find, but this could have easily have been manipulated. The Bolsheviks said nothing concrete about the whereabouts of the Romanovs until 1926, and then spoke of a probable assassination. So the alleged murder of Tsar Nicholas II and his immediate relatives is considered solved by historians, but this view does not meet modern standards of criminology. In any case, historians have never seriously researched in any other direction. We are expected to rely almost exclusively on descriptions by Soviet sources. White army soldiers were able to occupy the Ipatiev house and collect evidence roughly 8 days after the alleged murder of the Tsars. The investigations lasted several months and didn't really produce any results. Nikolai Alexeyevich Sokolov joined the investigation later on, and it was only a year later that Sokolov was able to begin to systematically evaluate the material. Sokolov didn't have much time because the rats were approaching again. His preliminary report was published in 1925. Until 1989, it was the only accepted historical account of the murders. It prompted the Soviets to issue a government-approved textbook in 1926 that largely plagiarized Sokolov's work, admitting that the Empress and her children had been murdered with the Tsar. Sokolov's report was banned in the USSR. The collected witness statements are near worthless. A priest named Storozhev said he was summoned more than once to the house to perform services. Why on earth would the Cheka do this if the orders were for strict secrecy? 2 women were also allowed into the house and a few more claimed to have seen the imperial family. They could not tell the real family from decoys. Comrade Andrei Strekotin claimed the Romanovs were murdered. Neighbors heard some shots. Others saw a truck transporting things. At the least, the Romanovs could have been could have been silently poisoned, just poisoned, stripped of all belongings and transported away to be hacked up or blown up with dynamite. All of this would have been remarkably easy. Instead, the Cheka left a building behind with bullet holes, removed segments of the walls, and scattered personal belongings of the Romanovs nearby while expecting the whites to approach. The Cheka made absolutely sure the priest and neighbors were aware of the Romanovs' presence. Much was left for Sokolov to find. Enough so the impression could be made the imperial family was dead, but nowhere near sufficient to confirm the murders. Guards employed by the Cheka gave statements. Mostly Kleshev and Deryabin spoke, supplementing each other's words. Lesnikov and Bruyazin claimed that they had seen this themselves. Why would the Cheka make an effort of secrecy but leave not only many physical traces but involve guards who then told Sokolov they had observed the killings against their orders? Most of the guards, it is claimed, remained at their posts. The leaders left behind encrypted telegrams which were promptly deciphered by Sokolov's helpers. Soviet official Sverdlov soon had newspapers print an admission that the Tsar had been murdered. So which was it? A secret act or just announcing it? The white official Milyukov testified about a telegram from King George of England to the Tsar. Quote, "It contained no concrete proposal with respect to the Tsar's fate. It was delivered to me as Minister of Foreign Affairs." Since this was an official communication addressed to Nicholas, who was no longer Tsar, Milyukov simply returned it to the British ambassador, Buchanan. Milyukov was convinced that the former Tsar and his family should go abroad. Buchanan talked to his government, which then stated its readiness to receive the imperial family in England, and a cruiser would come to remove them. Milyukov was convinced this message had reached Nicholas. All seemed like a no-brainer. Quote, "The cruiser, however, did not come, and there was no departure. There was some hitch, so to speak. I spoke a second time with Buchanan about this question, and he told me that the government of England was no longer insisting on the imperial family's departure for England. The insisting was done by the Russian provisional government, not by England." Kerensky's testimony is quoted in the Sokolov report. British Ambassador Buchanan presented the answer that, quote, "The government of England does not consider it possible to extend its hospitality to the former Tsar while the war continues." England does not consider it possible to extend its hospitality to the former Tsar. Now, the provisional Russian government was so disturbed by this answer, they convened a completely secret session without a written protocol. They used a former envoy to talk political figures in France to help save the imperial family. The French refused to become active. Sokolov even states the British government refused to pay him to bring the collected materials and the reports, including relics of the imperial family, to Europe. It was a French general, a Russian merchant, and a peasant who managed to pay Sokolov and save the investigation. Interesting. Sokolov writes that the provisional Russian government had told the world the Tsar was a traitor, that he had been preparing a separate peace with the enemy, Germany, to save his own personal and dynastic interests, meaning a catastrophe for the Allies. Prince Lvov had the movements of the Tsar restricted and then arrested him. The British and other governments in Europe were quite willing to save and host many Romanovs, who could always claim themselves emperors in exile. So why the cold response from the British regarding Nicholas? You have to remember, a lot of Romanovs simply left Russia. A lot of them. And their families. They just went on British ships and sailed for Italy or Denmark or, France or whatever. So there were a lot of Romanovs left that could still claim to be heirs of the throne. So why make such a big fuss about Nicholas then? Why the cold response? Why the cold response from the British regarding Nicholas? Maria Feodorovna was safe in Denmark with her many aristocratic relatives. Sokolov's assistant Paul Bulgin says the plan was to bring the materials to her and start processing it. She bizarrely ordered Sokolov to stay away from Denmark and gave him the equivalent of 1,000 British pounds, which would be around 56,000 pounds today. Not exactly a whole lot of money to process multiple suitcases and a shipping crate full of documents, photos, and samples about the most important murder case in the world. The potential blood samples were given a laboratory treatment. The Tsar's cousin, Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich, refused to accept the records. Sokolov and his assistant simply kept them in their shared apartment. 7 volumes were stolen by communists in Berlin and probably sent to Moscow. The assistant published his own report much later, as a simplified version of Sokolov's, and a few other people published further reports. In 1921, Paul Bykov, a Soviet, came out with a book which essentially plagiarized the information contained in the works of the anti-Soviet authors. The book, The Sokolov Investigation of the Alleged Murder of the Russian Imperial Family, contains a lot of commentary that is describing the work of the white investigators as chaotic and bungling. Quote, "The principal accounts, those of Sokolov, Dieterichs, and Wilton, clearly indicate that the Bolsheviks were making a sustained effort to deceive the white investigators and throw them off the track. Many kinds of false evidence were planted, and many of the witnesses known to be members of the Bolshevik Party were obviously lying. It was at least difficult to determine which of this evidence, if any, was real or truthful and which was false. The Bolsheviks, in other words, may have been attempting to conceal murder, or they may have been attempting to conceal an escape or release." 7 months after the capture of Yekaterinburg by the whites, Sokolov had been appointed as investigator. Before him, others had already worked on the case. So months and months and months of, walking around on a crime scene and digging through stuff, right? Quote, "Some of them reached the conclusion that all or part of the imperial family had been spared. General Dieterichs explained how the white garrison commander immediately selected people like the court investigator Nametkin, who quickly fell out of favor because he seemed to make the case more obscure. Sokolov even misrepresented the work of the earlier investigators to make himself appear more important. According to him, the court investigator had only spent 90 minutes at the mine shaft. In reality, the shafts were flooded and had to be drained. The assistant public prosecutor Magnitsky assembled a variety of qualified people to search the mines and the surrounding area. They probably had dogs available. But no bodies were found. Even military counter-espionage people were added to the investigation, but this did not produce results either, as the agents lost themselves in the wilderness of mirrors. They considered that the Tsar had been evacuated by agents on behalf of the German Kaiser Wilhelm, who was a cousin of the Tsar. Later, according to General Dieterichs, the assumption of the division staff was that the Tsar and his family were evacuated by the Bolsheviks. The investigation was largely a waste of time even before Sokolov came along. The author of the Sokolov investigation of the alleged murder of the Russian imperial family states, "The evidence of murder is not conclusive. It amounted to charred remains and hearsay. The Ipatiev house could have been previously used as a place to torture and execute people in the basement, leaving traces of blood and bullet holes. There are even completely contradictory statements from investigators about the number of bullet holes. Other presumed Romanov victims at Alapayevsk were believed to have been thrown into a mine shaft. Sokolov and Dieterichs both believed that the Bolsheviks had killed a peasant and put the body next to the scene to create the impression he had been a white soldier and that the Red and the Whites had a shootout. If the Reds were capable of this, why shouldn't they create more fabrications? The disfigured bodies retrieved were identified later by the Whites as some of the Romanovs using the identifying documents they found. This means we don't know at all whether the bodies were Romanovs." So again, most Romanovs just left, and was a large family, or a large clan. So most of the Romanovs just left Russia. The last Tsar was supposedly killed. His immediate family was supposedly killed, and I think 4 other Romanovs were supposedly killed. But as I just mentioned, charred remains. We can't really tell if who these bodies were. So it doesn't really help us that much. So the small scattered belongings of the Tsar and his family that were found near the Ipatiev house are in no way evidence of murder. If the decision had been made to smuggle them out, they would have likely been stripped of identifying items. Many objects were found, which does not look like a real cover-up by the Bolsheviks, but rather false leads. The giant forests of Siberia and the Ural Mountains were available to properly dispose of bodies. So why not use that opportunity? The Bolsheviks even left a quote on the wall at the Ipatiev house from Heine. Quote, Belshazzar was that very night seized by his slaves and killed outright. The Reds, who allegedly destroyed the bodies, went to a local communist club and bragged loudly so people would hear it. The hearsay from people questioned by the investigators was completely contradictory. But what about the decrypted telegrams mentioned by Sokolov? The one to Sverdlov makes little sense. The translation says, entire family suffered same fate as head. Officially, family will perish in evacuation. What does that mean? Why not cable the head and the family are dead instead? And does the rest of the message mean the perishing of the family in evacuation will be the official fake cover story? The translation into English may be flawed due to local Russian dialects. The captured Tsar had a high value for the Bolsheviks, and they could have simply sold him to the Brits or the ruling aristocracy of Denmark for ransom money. There was weird speculation by some investigators that he was handed to his German cousin, who was living in the Netherlands and had been his mortal enemy in World War I. Britain had an alliance with Russia, on the other hand. General Dieterichs was certainly interested in rumors about the German Kaiser making an offer of asylum to the Tsarina and the Grand Duchess at the urgence of the Tsarina's brother, the Grand Duke Ernest Louis of Hessen-Darmstadt. The offer, so the rumor goes, was rejected. Why would the Kaiser even make the offer when it was not the Hohenzollerns, when it was not the Hohenzollern family who really wanted the Romanovs, but the House of Hessen? Ernest Louis and his sisters were mostly raised by their grandmother, Queen Victoria in England. At Ernest's wedding, his younger sister Alex became engaged to the later Russian Tsar Nicholas II. So the family relations are quite clear. Queen Victoria stayed informed about Ernest in later years with the help of the British diplomat Sir George William Buchanan, member of the Privy Council. The man who had to tell the Russian provisional government that Britain was not interested in evacuating the Tsar and bringing him to England. So fashioning new cover identities for the Tsar and his family and changing their appearance was easy. In the unlikely case this ever got exposed, the Bolsheviks could simply say they had never been able to fully verify their deaths. The local Cheka must have lost them or something and lied to their superiors, and the white investigators simply erred. Only after the white investigators assumed the Tsar and the others were dead did the Soviets make official statements about an execution carried out by the local Cheka. So the Soviets actually followed, the whites. When some of the white investigators made these assumptions, then the Reds said, "Oh yeah, well, we probably dead." Probably. We know that many Romanovs were simply evacuated and carried off by British cruisers or left by other means and were welcomed in different European countries. But nobody really wanted the impression that the Tsar was alive. The Bolsheviks certainly did not want to admit publicly they spared the despot and sold him to his relatives. Many people back then did not understand properly the serious differences between the family of the fallen German Kaiser, the Hohenzollerns, and the House of Hessen. To many, all of them were simply German, even though the Hohenzollerns were never really liked by the Welfs, Wettins, and Regnars. The Hohenzollerns had fought the Tsar in World War I and wouldn't want to be publicly associated with him. Their only motive for saving him was to enforce the unwritten rules that monarchs should not be executed. The Kaiser himself was blamed for the outbreak of World War I, even though he was not the driving force behind it, because France had simply formed an alliance with the Brits and the Russians. If Tsar Nicholas was executed by the Bolsheviks, the Kaiser's head could be next. Britain's King George V, who feared revolutionary trends in Britain and the stability of his own throne, persuaded the Lloyd George government to rescind the offer that had been made to provide sanctuary for the imperial family. King George would have preferred that the Tsar disappears, but doesn't really die. The provisional Russian government didn't want Nicholas to die. Nicholas to die and see the satisfaction of the Bolsheviks, but also preferred he disappears. Much of the Tsar's wealth had been in real estate and mining, which was ultimately taken over by the Bolsheviks. Other assets were eaten up by the World War I effort. The remaining fortune became shrouded in myth because no one could really pinpoint caches of gold, secret bank accounts in Britain or the Netherlands, as well as stocks in London handled by intermediaries. Britain was quick to establish trade relations with the USSR, and this may have been part of a secret agreement. The Bolsheviks could have stashed away Nicholas, his family, 4 Grand Dukes and their families, releasing them one by one, while Britain was implementing the promised trade relations. It was also possible to transfer ownership of some Romanov stocks and bank accounts in London to intermediaries of the Bolsheviks. If the murders had taken place, the Soviet government would have possessed all relevant details, and the logical step after Sokolov's published report would have been to retrieve the bodies of the imperial family because there was the danger of dissidents finding them and creating an international public outrage. If remains were to be smuggled outside of the USSR, the anti-communists could turn them into relics. It has been claimed that 2 Soviet citizens knew Sokolov's report and managed to find the remains in 1979. At the late stage of the USSR in 1989, one of these adventurists published his accord, and 2 years later, an exhumation took place. Well, in 1977, the Ipatiev house where the Tsar allegedly died was ordered to be demolished because, according to Soviet logic, it was not sufficiently historically significant. That prohibited post-USSR researchers later from obtaining samples and testing them with new technology. The men who allegedly carried out the murders ended up dead themselves. Stepan Vaganov, Ermakov's close associate, was attacked and killed by peasants in late 1918 for his participation in local acts of brutal repression by the Cheka. Pavel Medvedev, head of the Ipatiev House Guard and one of the key figures in the murders, was captured by the White Army in Perm in February 1919. During his interrogation, he denied taking part in the murders and died in prison of typhus. Alexandre Beloborodov and his deputy Boris Ditkovsky were both killed in 1938 during the Great Purge. Philip Goloshiokin was shot in October 1941 in an NKVD prison and consigned to an unmarked grave. The leader, Yurovsky, lived until the age of 60 and was rewarded, but his accounts are contradictory. His son, Alexander Yurovsky, apparently handed over his father's memoirs to Avdonin and Ryabov in 1978, the 2 self-styled investigators who claimed to have found the remains of the Tsar and his family 1 year later. Lenin made sure to leave no real paper trail. Only hints have survived that indicate that Lenin wanted to move the baggage further so not to destroy it. On the 16th of July, the editors of Danish newspaper Nationaltidende queried Lenin to kindly wire facts in regards to a rumor that Nicholas II has been murdered. He responded, "Rumor not true. Ex-Tsar's safe. All rumors are only lies of capitalist press." Sverdlov granted permission for the local paper in Yekaterinburg to publish the execution of Nicholas, the bloody crowned murderer, shot without bourgeois formalities but in accordance with our new democratic principles, along with the coda that the wife and son of Nicholas Romanov had been sent to a safe place. An official announcement appeared in the national press 2 days later. It reported that the monarch had been executed on the order of Uralispolkom under pressure posed by the approach of the Czechoslovaks. No official document has been found of either Lenin or Sverdlov giving the order. In 2007, the official Russian investigation concluded there is no reliable evidence that Lenin and Sverdlov had made the decision. This gave the Putin dictatorship a clever excuse. The local Cheka guys did it. That way Putin could placate the leftists globally as well as signal the right-wingers that the Jewish communist world conspiracy was responsible and Putin has made peace with the imperial Romanov history of Russia. In 1993, the report of Yakov Yurovsky from 1922 was published, in which it is explained that units of the Czechoslovak Legion were approaching Yekaterinburg, so time was of the essence. To prevent the Tsar from falling into the hands of the Czech, he was murdered. Well, that's what the report says. On August 15th, 2000, the Russian Orthodox Church announced the canonization of the Romanov family for their humbleness, patience, and meekness, However, reflecting the intense debate preceding the issue, the bishops did not proclaim the Romanovs as martyrs, but passion bearers instead. So the Soviets had infiltrated the émigré circles from the first moment and turned the anti-communist international movement into radical adherents of classic conspiracy mythology. It was always planned to publicly ditch communism, and promptly in 1991, the exhumation was done of the supposed remains of the Tsar. 1 year after Putin took office, the Orthodox Church, run by his intelligence service, glorified the Romanovs. Putin hinted many times in public that a satanic Western or international conspiracy had destroyed the rule of the Romanovs and enforced communism in Russia. So again, always classic conspiracy mythology, just to make the target audience happy. The very successful American conspiracy influencer Alex Jones explained to his audience in 2024 that the Rothschild conspiracy had sent Jews to Russia to create the communist regime, but Putin finally managed to free his people from that conspiracy. So that's how this narrative is played. And so, so what about the supposed Tsar's body? What happened to that? The two men named Avdonin and Ryabov came across a photo of the vicinity of the crime scene in Sokolov's book, finally visited the site in 1979 and spontaneously found the bodies, we were told. They claimed they did what hordes of highly motivated investigators couldn't do decades earlier. So these two guys, they managed to do it, they say. They say they took 3 skulls with them and put them back a year later. In 1989, towards the end of the Soviet Union, Ryabov published his find, and 2 years later the exhumation took place. Avdonin, a geologist by trade in the Soviet years, was personally interested in local history and folklore. In 1976, he met Soviet writer and filmmaker Geli Ryabov. The excavation in 1991 was done crudely with bulldozers, not archaeological equipment. Russian, British, and American forensic experts agreed that the Romanovs' remains had been found. The DNA tests were carried out by the Russian Dr. Pavel Ivanov and Dr. Peter Gill from the Forensic Science Service in the UK. Generously, Prince Philip Mountbatten, husband of Queen Elizabeth II of Great Britain, and a close relative of the Tsars, donated a blood sample for comparison. This was cross-checked by Dr. Erika Hagelberg from the University of Cambridge. This means that the investigations were carried out by researchers from countries with an interest in declaring the Tsars dead. The DNA had already been largely destroyed and the remains had been in the custody of the Russian state, where someone could easily have contaminated them. If there was any usable DNA left, the existing fragments could artificially be copied and multiplied using a method such as PCR. Contamination would therefore be easy. In 2004, scientists from the United States criticized the findings of the British Forensic Science Service and suggested that the bone remains had been accidentally or intentionally contaminated. AFDIL was used for the test because Peter Sarandinaki from the Scientific Expedition to Account for the Romanov Children Foundation was able to persuade the Russian government to do so. An old shirt of the Tsar with traces of blood that he wore during an assassination attempt in Japan is said to have suddenly appeared in a museum. According to other reports, it was a scarf or a handkerchief. As if by a miracle, it was not thrown away, but kept, and a DNA sample could even have been obtained from it, even though the material and blood had been exposed to sunlight and oxygen for almost 100 years. The scientist, Rogaev, was thrilled. All individual bodies were identified using the PCR method and compared with the blood stain on the shirt or the cloth. The Japanese scientist Tatsuo Nagai doubted the test results as early as 1997, and in 1999 compared hair samples from Georgy Romanov with the gene sequence that Dr. Peter Gill from the Forensic Science Service in Great Britain presented. There was no match. The criticized researchers responded that the hair sample was contaminated without admitting that the Russians may have deliberately contaminated the alleged Romanov body remains. Then there was an examination by Dr. Alec Knight at Stanford University, which was cross-checked by other scientists and published in the journal Annals of Human Biology. Knight criticized the use of the PCR method. DNA from bones that lay at a shallow depth underground for over 70 years in an area where it gets quite warm in the summer must have decayed to such an extent that it's difficult to find pieces longer than 250 base pairs. So if a sequence of 1,223 base pairs were detected in all 9 corpses, it could only be a contamination. Dr. Knight and his team also examined the DNA from a finger of Elizabeth, the sister of Tsar Nicholas's wife, Alexandra. Peter de Knief, head of the Forensic DNA Research Laboratory at Leiden University Medical Center in Holland, agreed that Gil and Ivanov's original studies were not entirely convincing. Ivanov also refused to let others take a look at the blood-stained handkerchief or shirt that the Tsar had allegedly used to dab a wound in Japan. Ivanov kept the details of this alleged 100-year-old blood sample to himself and claimed that after his examination, the DNA had now finally decayed, no longer of any use to anybody. The lawyer Daryl Lidwin spoke with an expert on Russian history at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University who recommended a re-evaluation of the Romanov case. So, if we don't have a convincing DNA analysis, the bodies are not convincing, and without bodies, it is not proven by criminalistic standards that the Tsar's family was even murdered at all. Nowadays, if a prosecutor wants to charge a person with murder but no body has turned up, then the prosecutor has a very bad hand. It is important to remember the magnitude of this matter. Our conventional 20th century understanding of history is based on a ridiculous DNA analysis of ancient bones that were in the care of the Russian state and were probably deliberately contaminated. If we consider the possibility that the Tsar's family had fled, then they would most likely have gone into hiding. They would have most likely gone into hiding with relatives in Britain or Denmark. So, and also the aristocrats infiltrated socialism early. Tsar Nicholas was part of the Hessen-Darmstadt, Hessen-Kassel families as well as related to the Danish royal family. The Danish royal family, the British royal family, and he was even a third-degree nephew of the German Emperor Wilhelm II. He married his cousin, Alex of Hessen-Darmstadt, granddaughter of the British Queen Victoria, in a big wedding. Tsarist intelligence had indeed infiltrated terrorist circles, factory worker strike movements, the peasant class, and merchant circles. The First World War ultimately saw the Tsar deploying 4 million men, but they did not have nearly enough rifles and ammunition. British aid kept Russia in the war. Every Russian soldier lost was another soldier, which the regular Russian aristocracy could never deploy again domestically to change the leadership and power structure of Russia. Influential staff members of Tsar Nicholas were of course from the British orbit, men from the environment of the British elite University of Oxford and the Secret Service SIS or MI6. The Russian nobleman Felix Yusupov, who had married into the Romanov clan, had been accepted into the Bullingdon Club student organization while studying in Oxford, where future British kings, British nobles, future political stars and businessmen mingled. Yusupov also took part in the plot to kill Rasputin, who had used his considerable influence to stir up sentiment against Russia's involvement in the First World War. If Russia had withdrawn from the war, the Germans would no longer have been in the grip of a two-front war and could have deployed virtually all their troops against Britain, France, and the USA. The Briton Samuel Hoare, 1st Viscount Templewood, had also been in the Bullingdon Club in Oxford, learned Russian as a military officer, and was recruited by the Secret Service Chief Mansfield Cumming from SIS MI6 to maintain connections with the Russian Secret Service in St. Petersburg. Hoare's career later extended into the Second World War. Captain Stephen Alley, an SIS MI6 agent most likely involved in the assassination attempt on Rasputin, had grown up in a Yusupov family home. The SIS or MI6 agent John Scale served in the propaganda department, Anglo-Russian Commission in St. Petersburg, which is also involved in British supplies for the Russian military. Oswald Rayner had studied at Oxford, where he became friends with Yusupov and eventually joined the SIS. Rayner is said to be the only man with a gun at the scene of Rasputin's murder. Another acquaintance of Yusupov was the Briton Albert Stopford, who had connections to Queen Victoria, King Edward VII, and King George V. Stopford spied for the British War Office. Now, socialist ideas had gained traction in previous generations when roughly 90% of the population were serfs, mostly farmers with only rudimentary legal protection. The simple plan envisioned envisioned toppling the aristocrats, ending the influence of the church, redistributing the land and the assets, and then making private ownership illegal. No socialist ever had a clear idea how a socialist system would actually work in practice. Furthermore, the socialist activists and revolutionaries did not have any meaningful legal protection against searches and seizures, torture, and pressure against family members. This made it relatively easy for the police to infiltrate the leftist movement in different countries. In German Prussia, for example, the ruling aristocracy intended to control social democrats and slowly improve the working conditions and wages without risking insurgencies. France was hoping to placate the workers and farmers as well. Britain thought socialism was a tool to destabilize France and Germany. And that is how the aristocracy got itself into this dangerous game. It was a much bigger risk than running operations under the cover of the far less radical Enlightenment ideas. You know, working with communists in spy work, that's really dangerous. Germany was still saturated with old aristocratic spy networks of the supercluster of Welfs, Wettins, and Regenars. The League of Communists tried to push a revolution through actions and publications, including participation in civil war-like struggles and various failed uprising attempts. On the European mainland, turmoil was raging everywhere, but there was relative calm in Britain. For the supercluster, the infiltration of socialist circles was more than just protecting themselves from the radicals and causing trouble for competing empires. British capitalism was to remain an elitist affair for the benefit of a tight circle. Most people would be losers in the system, and certain socialist policies controlled from above could be a new form of serfdom that is not called serfdom. A bureaucratic system where you have to work under dictated conditions and you have no real way to escape. And it goes on, with these famous socialists and their, and how the spy services were after these, later famous revolutionaries. I mean, we know a bunch of them who were confirmed informants, left in the leftist, in leftist groups, lots of confirmed informants, and then there's characters like Karl Marx. Thanks to his father's connections, Karl Marx married the aristocrat Jenny von Westphalen. Her ancestors included high-ranking officials from Prussia who, for example, headed the Ministry of the Interior and were therefore responsible for espionage against revolutionary groups. In 1751, Philip von Westphalen became secretary to the Prussian Lieutenant General and Freemason Ferdinand von Braunschweig, the brother-in-law of the Prussian king and Freemason Friedrich II. Ferdinand was also a member of the Illuminati, the Bavarian Illuminati order, which also included people like the Landgraf Karl of Hessen-Kassel. Ferdinand von Braunschweig was in command of the allied troops of England, Hanover, and Prussia. Philip of Westphalen also took on an important military function, and the British King George III from the House of Hanover gave him a title. Philip married a noblewoman with Scottish ancestry. His son was Ludwig von Westphalen, and his son, Ferdinand Otto, in turn, became Prussian interior minister and was therefore responsible for espionage against revolutionary groups. Ludwig's daughter Jenny eventually married Karl Marx. The Marx-friendly historians try to make it seem as if there were tensions between Jenny and her family, even though the facts show a very normal family relationship. Of all people, Ludwig von Westphalen suggested Saint-Simon's ideas of socialism to Marx, and Marx later dedicated his doctoral thesis to Ludwig. So there's a whole big story about Karl Marx, and I've gone into this before. You can find a video on this channel. There's also an interesting backstory about the Lenins. How did this, especially this one guy from the family, how become so popular and so powerful? Even though he moved around Europe a lot, and every spy agency was after him, and they all tried to control this. They all tried to control this movement, and also there's a very interesting. There's a very interesting book that I would recommend. A book by the author Edward Ellis Smith. He wrote about the young Stalin as a young revolutionary, and how likely it was that intelligence, that spy agencies, eventually recruited the young Stalin, because there was no other way for him. He was arrested too many times. He was too much on the radar, and it was very easy for the government to control these people, and use them to infiltrate the movement further. At some point, you just couldn't refuse getting recruited. And the author of the book, Edward Ellis Smith, he was a historian, writer, foreign service officer, and CIA agent. So he served in World War II. Then he learned Russian, and he attended the Strategic Intelligence School at the Pentagon, Counterintelligence School at Camp Holabird. Then he started work at the American Embassy in Moscow. Then he was appointed by the U.S. Army Intelligence Department as a department head investigating the economic and political department of the Soviet Union, and on and on and on. He resigned towards the end of 1953 to become a CIA intelligence officer and served various missions throughout Moscow. So you can find that also in my book, with some additional information and commentary and context. And the book from Smith, it ends with this eerie notion that it seemed like there were these old spy networks still going on in Soviet Russia. Some of these leftover, what he assumed, these leftover networks were still there. Old networks that came from the Tsarist era, and it seemed like at some point, ultimately, these spy networks won. They finally kind of won against the communists by controlling the communists potentially. So this is an interesting end to that book. Now, I of course was already much deeper into this whole background and this whole espionage background, and it should have been a part. There should have been a part 2 of that Smith book, but there never was a part 2 of that book, unfortunately, because that's kind of the next step to take. What were the old spy networks? How old is espionage really, professional espionage, and how many of these old structures are still there? You can find my book on Amazon. You see the link in the description below. The book is called "The Staged Fall of the USSR and Its True Relationship with China."